I'm going to first start out with this idea, and I haven't run all these things by you guys, so I'll you can jump in at any point. But this idea that the COVID-19 policy of indefinite universal isolation is immoral and un-American. So I want to start out by saying the following: that I absolutely believe we should be very concerned about COVID-19, and in particular because it's very good at human, in the bad sense, at human to human transmission. Now, I think there's a lot of unknown about how good it is, but there's a lot of evidence that it's quite good, and that's a very that's an undesirable attribute for a virus to have. Now, it's not airborne in the technical sense, and that's going to be important. It's not something that can just be that you can just pass easily to somebody 600 feet away, and so that has implications for what policy should be. It's not like, I believe, measles has that kind of quality, but it is something that's a real concern that I think government has a certain role in, and but both with government and individuals, we need to think about how do we deal with this in a way that's consistent with human flourishing. And then part of that, and the part I want to focus on today, is people being free to pursue their livelihoods. And this is something that I've noticed, and it's been really upsetting, that when people are making their personal and corporate and certainly political policies about this, the whole focus is how do we slow the rate of spread of this virus, which is itself, that's obviously an important consideration, but there's very little focus on how do we protect people's right to pursue their livelihoods. And what we've seen is the implicit policy that's being embraced increasingly is what I'm calling indefinite universal isolation. So I want to break that down because all the points of that are important. So isolation, I'll start with isolation, is the idea that people are being isolated from one another. It's often called social distancing. I think isolation captures more the negative of it. And so that's one element of it. And all things being equal, when there's contagious diseases around, one wants to be more isolated to protect oneself from it. So there's that element. But then there's the universal element of it, which I want to come back to and really challenge, which is that everyone should be doing this. And this is increasingly the policy if you look at, closing down schools and closing down all kinds of workplaces. And, it's the idea that everybody should be doing this. And then finally, there's indefinite, and this is a really important aspect of it, that there's no clear timeline on how long this is going to last. Sometimes there will be a specific date on something, but there's no overall plan of how long, how long this will be. And the first thing to say about this indefinite universal isolation is that it is drastically harming the livelihood of, conservatively, tens of millions of Americans. I would really say the vast majority of the country. And it's harming them. And at the same time, they themselves are under no significant risk from COVID-19. So I'm not yet saying what the policy should be, but I just think that's a very important fact, that this policy is drastically harming the livelihood of tens of millions and really most of the country. And most people are under no significant risk from it. So the significant risk is for what they'll call the vulnerable, which is, the elderly, and then people who are what's called compromised. And so I'll just give you an example of the harm of this, and then I'll talk about the justice of it. So my girlfriend works as a therapist for kids with autism. And we are being told that, well, you should avoid any kind of interaction. Like, you want to maximize your social distancing. And so she works with clients. So she'll go to the homes of clients, and she'll be around the parents and around the kids. And the kids need in-person therapy. So if she's working with a kid and, he's just learning some reading skills and verbal skills, it's like that, it will permanently negatively affect him if she's not there, for a month or 2 months. And what she's being told is, hey, you shouldn't be around this kid at all, and we're not sure how much. And so that's obviously very affects her livelihood, because she makes money largely from clients paying her to help to give this great value to kids with autism whose lives she can vastly improve. So it's her livelihood is being attacked, and then the livelihood of the kid is being attacked, even though there is no real threat to either of them. There are many, many things that are more threatening. I mean, she's much more threatened by just driving over there than this thing. And so this should really give us pause that we are restricting the livelihood of really hundreds of millions of people who themselves are not under threat. And we're also, it's not that they are spewing something that is truly airborne in the sense is like impossibly contagious where nobody can be isolated from it. So I think the basic moral thing is, as much as possible, at least over the long term, if it's a long-term thing, we want individuals to engage in selective isolation. I think there are a couple of criteria here, but not universal isolation, but more selective isolation based on, one, is their vulnerability. So if you're super vulnerable to this, and we're going to talk about some of the problems largely created by government of lack of testing and then lack of expected lack of treatment facilities. But whatever the situation is, yeah, you want to engage in selective isolation. And I think people should be willing to take fairly extreme measures. And with loved ones, we should be, thinking of someone in particular, in my case, I'm very close with who's in that age group. And we should be willing to take pretty extreme measures in terms of supporting them and cordoning them off. And isolation does not mean everybody's quarantined on some island and they're each getting it. No, you isolate them from each other as well, or at least, if they want to, you make it as easy as possible. So the key criterion has to be level of vulnerability. That should drive selective isolation. But the other thing that should drive selective isolation is how affordable is it for you to isolate? And this will vary from person to person vastly. So for example, in Silicon Valley, you have many people advocating indefinite universal isolation, and they themselves are people who work at software companies. They're often, I don't want to make caricatures, but they're often introverted. They don't necessarily feel the need to be around that many people. I'm somewhat like this myself in terms of my writing work and whatnot. So if you can easily afford it, then there's a real case for isolating yourself to a certain degree, particularly if there's a reasonable time horizon with it. And then there are also, part of, you can isolate yourself in a less social sense, but you can just take certain kinds of precautions that are good for your health anyway, such as, because even though it's not deadly to you, the COVID-19, it can be a real pain if you get it. So things like washing hands and, and not coughing in the air and that kind of thing. And these kinds of things can be incredibly, they can help dramatically slow transmission. But notice that both of these are individuals taking responsibility and doing things that are consistent with their livelihoods. But what my girlfriend is being told to do, and what most of us are being told to do, is really shut down your livelihood for something that's not really threatening to you. Now, I want to talk about this issue of indefinite, because there's a certain threshold at which it may need to be universal, or I don't think universal, but at least in certain locations. But if that's the case, there are a couple of criteria that need to be followed. So one is that the government should give a really clear explanation of why universal is necessary. And I think in this case, some of the dynamics are, one is that testing got totally screwed up. So it's just so hard to know what to do because we have no idea how many people have this. And I don't think we know that anywhere. So the state of testing is really bad. And there were definite screw ups there by government. And then the other thing is, lack of some of these basic elements of treatment like face masks and whatnot. So there's just some really terrible stuff going on where medical workers are being exploited and at risk and sometimes dying because they're being exposed to such huge loads of this virus. And that's really bad. And if there's something where the government, so if there's like a specific time limited circumstance, then then that's reasonable if the government can really explain how it applies to us and it can really give a reasonable time frame of it. But I think crucial to this is government needs to acknowledge where it made mistakes. And I'm not talking about, I don't want to talk about parties or individual personalities, but in terms of the testing and the supplies, we have for better or worse, and I believe worse, we have a largely government controlled healthcare system, and certainly where government plays a massive role in approving or not approving things, including tests for COVID-19. So there has to be, if they're asking for this kind of major setback, then there needs to be a really clear reason why, an explanation of what went wrong, what they did wrong, and then a really clear time horizon. And with all of this, there just needs to be an acknowledgement that it is so crucial for people to be free to pursue their livelihoods and their lives. And what we're seeing is just that is on such the back burner, and you, as a result, you just meet so many people who are being negatively affected by this. And just everywhere you go, at least in my experience, what have you guys found in terms of just how people are being affected by the indefinite universal isolation policies?
I mean, it's definitely varied at this point. I think, I have everything from friends who are, in industries that are actually benefiting from this economically, just in the sense of there's higher demand for certain kinds of medical services. Set aside the people who are actually in the front lines in that industry, which is a different scenario, down to people who, they do like wedding photography and things like that, and they have zero money and, in some cases don't have any savings. But I think the one thing that has been universal across all of the people I've spoken to is exactly what you're talking about, which is or part of what you're talking about, which is the psychological costs of not knowing when life will return to normal, and of how bad things could get just on an economic level if this goes on further and further.
Stefan, what about you?
Well, I live in Germany, so my situation is a little bit different. But so in general, the reaction by the government has been somewhat confused, and I've seen, or there's something like a restaurant ban, but only after 6 p.m. because the food industry is essential, but like after 6 p.m. The virus apparently appears like a vampire. There have been impacts in particular branches where they need, as you mentioned, human contact, like face-to-face contact. Other branches, like the online gaming platform Steam, showed record player numbers because lots of people globally have been locked down, and so they make more money now than they usually do. But it's yeah, so it's very selective. It's often confusing, and it strikes me as totally not sustainable, because if you take it seriously, you don't know who is infected because the testing has been lacking. Then you have to lock down everything, but that's not sustainable because a lot of people need to do work. Because if we just stop working for 3 months, all of us will be dead because nothing is produced and nothing can be consumed. So it's really very confusing, and I think a lot of this has to do with, you know, that the government coordinates this and politicians arbitrarily shut down things because they don't want to be responsible if something happens. And on the other hand, they didn't prepare the government healthcare system, and in Germany it's even more so than in the United States. They didn't prepare for the situation in any meaningful sense, so they have no information to work with. So it's sort of a mixed bag of half measures, and yeah, a lot of people will be impacted, and it's somewhat arbitrary.